Hello. So, in this second installment of our World War I review for your IB history exam, we're going to talk about the long term causes of the First World War. And we're going to start discussing there with imperial rivalries in the 19th century. The late 19th century sees a rise in imperial expansion of European powers, aided by some developments of the Industrial Revolution and what is known as the Second Industrial Revolution, things like the steamboat and the machine gun, the development of an anti-malarial drug called quinine. It's going to allow Europeans to colonize parts of the world that they were previously only able to take part in trading with. For example, before the mid 1800s, you only see European powers on the coastlines of Africa. But by the late 1800s, you see virtually the entire continent, short of a couple independent nations like Ethiopia and Liberia, completely colonized by European powers. Question comes, why colonize? We've got some economic factors there, impacts of the Industrial Revolution, European powers needing raw materials to feed their industrial production, and then needing new markets to sell their production to. And then you've got, with regard to the development of a rivalry, you've got European powers being concerned about protectionism between each other, leading for a desire of these powers to be self-sufficient, that they can find the resources for themselves and sell to markets for themselves, as other nations might freeze them out. There's also a political and a military reason for imperialism. The empires can give an extension of the rivalries that already existed in Europe at the time. You're going to notice that most of these European powers are finding strategic locations for their colonies, not just for economic gain, but also, for example, when we're talking about colonies in the Pacific, as way stations and refueling points for steamships as they would make their way across an ocean. Also, having colonies gives greater access to manpower in times of war for armies, and that will certainly be seen in the First World War. Finally, there's a nationalistic idea behind imperialism. Empires bring a sense of pride to the nation. Great Britain certainly was proud of the fact that, as they would say, that the sun never set on the British Empire. And with Germany on the rise, Germany is said to be looking for their place in the sun, to have an empire like the British and like the French have long enjoyed. Great powers would be stepping on each other's toes in their quest for empire, especially between Britain, France, and Germany. One area that we should point out to you is what is known as the Moroccan crisis between Germany and France. As early as 1905, there was an agreement between Britain and France called the 1904 Entente Cordiale that recognized the French control of Morocco in northern Africa. Germany, however, in 1905 would recognize the Moroccan Sultan as an independent ruler. And this is obviously going to cause some issue between between France and Germany, who had long been rivals already. Ultimately, France will, in the aftermath of an international conference in 1906 that recognizes French interests in Morocco, this will largely be resolved, only to rise again in 1911 when a German gunship arrives on the Moroccan port of Agadir, claiming to support German interests in the area, but also supporting a popular uprising against the French. And the French would see this as a threat. Each side, Germany and France, would prepare for a war. A resolution would ultimately come, with France gaining control in Germany's eyes over Morocco, but France giving up some of their holdings in the Congo region of Africa. Both France and Britain are becoming more distrustful of Germany's intentions in Africa here. And that's just one example of imperialism leading to greater rivalries between European powers. Another point that we look to with the lead up to the Second World War is the idea of nationalism. Nationalism as an ideology grows throughout the 19th century and really becomes a dominant ideology in the 19th century, whether it is the nationalism of already established nations or the nationalism of peoples hoping for their own independence. This is particularly strong in the Balkan Peninsula. Here we have a map of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. that you can see divided based on ethnic background of the people living within the empire. And you can see some tremendous diversity. Of special note to us is the large population of Serbs who live in the Austrian region of Bosnia. Their push for nationalism is going to be one of the immediate causes for the First World War. German leadership is going to be pushing the idea of German nationalism and German superiority over their neighbors. The Russians are supporters of a pan-Slavic movement where all Slavs should stand together with, of course, Russia in the lead. You've also got a growth in French nationalism as the French are fueled by anti-German sentiments to regain the lost territories of Alsace and Lorraine that they lost in the 1870-71 Franco-Prussian War. You also see with this notion of nationalism that war is very popular at this time and romanticized. There has not been a major European war, long-lasting or between multiple states since the ages of Napoleon in the early 19th century. Wars were typically short and were typically involving only two belligerents. So there weren't really major wars that people in 1914 could lean on to say, well, that's something that we should probably avoid. Also, at the time, there was very little battlefield reporting, and any that did exist at the time was heavily censored. And this would give people in Europe a somewhat of a false or romantic sense of what the wars were. You also have the development in the late 19th century of notions of social Darwinism, that, within the human race, just like in the biological world, it was a survival of the fittest game. And war was something that could weed out the weaker of humanity. And war was seen as to be a cure-all for any social ills that a society might be going through. This connects directly to the growth in militarism prior to World War I. The value of a state, whether it be Britain or France or Germany, was seen in the prowess of its military. You would see a dramatic expansion of military size and expenditures in the years before 1914, and we can see that here with all of the major belligerents in the First World War, and how, especially between the years 1912 and 13, we see some sizable jumps in the growth of their military, but really from the early 20th century until the First World War, tremendous growth in the expenditures on their militaries. You can take a look here as we see that Great Britain in 1914 certainly had the greatest number of warships on the open seas, but Germany was rapidly working to catch up to them. You can also see prior to 1914 the militarization of civil society with the beginnings of what we can call quasi-military organizations like the Boy Scouts in England first. Where the original Boy Scout motto that many might know as "Be Prepared" actually had its origins a little bit more than that. Be prepared, these scouts were told, to die for your country, so that when the time comes, you may charge home with confidence, not caring whether you are to be killed or not. It's a little different than the starting fires and tying knots that many of us would associate with scouting today. We can see the development of the First World War also in terms of an arms race that grew in the years prior to 1914. This is led to by a number of factors, including increased communication and transportation capabilities of European powers, increased industrial capacities of European powers, new technological advances like more efficient explosives. And I believe I've already mentioned the idea of the second industrial revolution, which had a lot of advancements in terms of electrical use and chemicals. So we're going to get more efficient explosives, more accurate rifles and artillery, heavier artillery, self-loading machine guns, iron-hulled, steam-powered ships like you guys see before you in the British Dreadnought battleship, which was developed in 1906. The development of submarines, the earliest airplanes. You guys hopefully remember that the Wright brothers made their first flight in 1903, and the next decade saw tremendous advancements in manned aircraft. There will also be the development of massive standing armies in the years before 1913 or 1914. The Industrial Revolution also gives European powers the ability to build massive armies and equip them and feed them and clothe them. Age limits would be expanded in the lead up to World War I with regard to compulsory military service for most of the great powers of Europe, which would just tremendously grow the size of those armies. We would also see in the years before the First World War the development of peacetime war plans. Here we see the original Schlieffen Plan of Germany from 1905, and we'll talk much more about this in a later video. The Schlieffen Plan of Germany was Germany's solution to dealing with the threat of a war on two fronts. The hope for Germany was to avoid that two-front war by quickly defeating France, by invading France through Belgium, and defeating France within a timetable of 42 days, which was calculated by the Germans to be the time that the Russians would need to mobilize and start invading. So France could be defeated, and Germany would be able to rush to their other border to stop the now incoming Russian army. Germany was not alone in making peacetime war plans. The French were also at their own peacetime plans. Up to 1914, the last French plan was known as Plan 17, which called for a frontal assault into Germany to regain Alsace and Lorraine. Also, in any discussion about long-term causes of the First World War, you will hear about the alliances that will be formed. The increasing military might of the great powers caused them all to look for friends should any conflict arise, or to just avoid any major conflict. This begins with what's known as the Dual Alliance between Germany and Austria-Hungary in 1879. Germany hoped to prevent France from forming any kind of continental alliance that would allow them to take Alsace and Lorraine back. Again, those were the territories lost by France in the Franco-Prussian War. Germany would have hoped to stay on good terms with both Austria-Hungary and Russia, but as Austria and Hungary and Russia had issues with each other, Germany had to pick a side, and they ultimately chose Austria-Hungary because it would be easier for Germany to stay the dominant power in that relationship compared to any kind of German-Russian alliance. Eventually, by 1882, Italy will join into that alliance to form what is known as the Triple Alliance. France and Russia signed their own agreement in 1894 called the Dual Entente. Entente is a French word for agreement. This was originally directed actually at Britain, as both France and Russia wanted to protect overseas empires, and that was directed at Britain, who was growing increasingly large in areas of both importance to France and Russia. But later, this Entente was directed towards Germany, as France and Russia with an alliance could force Germany to hopefully stay out of any future war, knowing that they would have to split their armies into two. This would give Germany a tremendous sense of being boxed in, or in the language of the First World War, being encircled. The British and the French would sign their own Entente in 1904 called the Entente Cordiale, which would ease tensions between those two countries as they each recognized each other's colonial possessions. The British and the Russians would sign their own Entente in 1907, which settled disagreements about spheres of influence in Asia between the two of them. Out of these original ententes, we will see the Triple Entente evolve, and by 1914, Britain, France, and Russia all agreed to avoid making any kind of separate peace in any war that would come. Now, I've long talked to my students, and most students of the First World War have probably heard an acronym to remember all of these long-term causes for the First World War. This is an acronym we'll talk about in a later lecture about the historiography of the First World War and the causes of the war. But keep in the back of your mind the acronym MAIN, M-A-I-N, to help you remember these long-term causes: militarism and alliances and imperialism and nationalism. If you can keep those in the back of your mind, we will attach at a later date a little discussion about the historian Sidney Fay, who develops this thesis in the 1920s. But that'll be for another date. So for now, if you can remember militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism, and be able to explain a little bit about each of those, you will be set for your long-term causes of the First World War. Thanks for tuning in.